In August 2022, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights released a report saying that serious human rights violations against Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim communities have been committed. The report said that allegations of patterns of tortures and ill treatment, including forced medical treatment and adverse conditions of detention. Now 3 years have passed since the publication of the report. So what has changed? Have conditions improved on the ground? Or has the abuses simply become harder to see? You're listening to The Divide. My name is Iris Xu. Today I'm speaking with someone who has spent years documenting the abuses the Uyghur communities have experienced.
My name is Peter Irwin. I work as the Associate Director for Research and Advocacy at the Uyghur Human Rights Project. We're based in Washington, D.C.
Peter recently wrote an article that was published by Foreign Policy magazine. It is titled, International Hotel Giants Are Profiting Despite Genocide in Xinjiang. Peter and his colleague Henry Sidisky have discovered that international hotel chains have significantly expanded their presence in the Uyghur region, while crimes against humanity and genocide are still ongoing.
The genesis of this was some of the tourism research we have been doing. So my colleague Henryk Stachewski, our research director, was looking into the expansion, really the vast expansion of tourism operations across the Uyghur region. And it's really part of a broader effort of ours to look at the so-called normalization of conditions in the Uyghur region, or Xinjiang. And I really do have to go back a few years. You go back to 2017 and 2018, where you see this mass spike in arbitrary detention, in re-education camps. You see the effects of a massive spike in the prison population, which I've also done some research on. And then you get these governments and the UN and others coming out and saying, look, this looks like genocide. This looks like crimes against humanity, certainly systemic human rights violations. So myself and my colleague in particular have been doing research on the last couple of years, sort of in the aftermath, I would say, of this the most obvious forms of systemic human rights violations, what we would see as atrocity crimes. And what you see is the Chinese government and state media in particular really promoting tourism as a means of suggesting or arguing that, there's not much to see here. Everything is open. The region is opened up. Tourists are coming to the region. They talk about the number of tourists a lot in like the hundreds of millions, which is an astronomical number. They talk about sort of the people time tourists, so the number of tourists who visit sites and things like this. They talk about UNESCO heritage sites. So we did some research, and my colleague in particular did research on how this tourism operations have expanded vastly, how international tourism operators, for example, were sort of getting in on the action. And a report on tourism, actually, we try to push some of those tourism companies abroad, the international companies, to stop running these tours. And actually, some of them did. What you found is a lot of the tourism companies were repeating in their itineraries, they were repeating Chinese state narratives about what's happening in the Uyghur region, just basically promoting cultural erasure. That's kind of by way of introduction in terms of what's been happening so far and how tourism has exploded. A couple of years ago is this expansion of international hotels. We thought, are there international hotels in the region? And there were quite a few. And then more recently, really by the end of 2024, we actually started to notice a much more significant expansion. I started going on these hotel construction project websites where they would show all of the hotels and like all of the companies that are building hotels in the future. And we noticed this massive spike, especially from these 5 companies. So there's one French company, Accor. There's 4 American companies, Hilton, Marriott, Wyndham, and Hyatt. And there's a British company called IHG, Intercontinental Hotels, and they were really just on a building spree. That's kind of where things started.
According to Peter and his colleague Henrik, dozens of hotels under Accor, Hilton, Intercontinental, Marriott, and Wyndham brands can be found across the Uyghur region, in which Uyghur families have been torn apart by internment, imprisonment, forced labor programs, and enforced disappearance.
We're looking for really nefarious connections that these hotels had with things like forced labor, other abuses, and that was sort of where this started. So we found with Accor, this big French multinational company, we found forced labor connections. The ILO, for example, independent experts have found that there has been widespread and systematic forced labor across the region, state-imposed forced labor that's affected millions of people so far. And we found that Accor, for example, was affected in two ways. Firstly, one of their hotels was actually making use of forced labor through a labor transfer program at one of their hotels directly. So they were staffing a hotel through a forced labor transfer program. And then what we saw also is that Accor, through its strategic partners called H World, it's a Chinese company, we found that this company was directly involved in forced labor as well. So it's an indirect connection, but forced labor is what we found with Accor. We also found that ownership structures and management partnerships, there's these very clear links between these international hotel chains and Chinese companies that were state-owned enterprises, right? And we see that as being problematic when you have state-owned enterprises, the state itself in the Uyghur region in particular, which is the one that is committing these atrocities, that you have these direct connections with these state-owned companies.
Accor is a French company. The country hails its respect for human rights, their protection, and their implementation as the founding principles of the French Republic, as well as key priorities for French diplomacy. But these principles don't seem to be practiced by its corporations. On February 6, an investigation by French media outlet disclosed, in collaboration with the television program Cash Investigation, revealed that clothing products manufactured for leading French sport retailer Decathlon had come from factories in China using Uyghur forced labor. And this revelation draws criticism from human rights organizations around the world. Now let's continue with Peter's findings.
One case in particular, which was quite egregious, and this has been reported previously back in 2021, is that Hilton, through a franchisee, built a Hampton by Hilton branded hotel on the site of a demolished mosque in Hilton, in the southern region of the Uyghur region.
In the past few years, thousands of mosques in Xinjiang have been damaged and destroyed, all in the name of counter-terrorism and de-extremification.
Now, this created an uproar back in 2021, I believe, because it's very clearly, directly related to another aspect of the Chinese government's repression of Uyghurs, which is the destruction of mosques and basically the erasure of religious freedom. Uyghurs can't have a copy of a Quran. They can barely go to the mosque. Religious rights are basically nil in the region at the moment. And then you see this company, this foreign company, American company, Hilton, coming in and literally building on the site of a mosque that has been demolished. UHRP and other organizations have found that the Chinese government has demolished upwards of 15,000 mosques. Something like 60% of the mosques in the Uyghur region were either damaged or destroyed. And then Hilton's coming in and basically taking the site of this demolished mosque and building atop it. At the time, in 2021, again, it caused an uproar. Hilton basically said, and this is typical of these companies, look, this is our partner, this is our franchisee, we don't have control over this. And then the furor kind of died down at the time. We found that this hotel ended up opening in 2024, and you can go on their website and you can find this hotel. And it's this really massive building, and we show in our report, you can see it with a GIF, you can see that the mosque is existing, it being demolished, and then you see the construction company building this hotel, and it opened in late 2024, and you can go on Hilton's website and find this hotel, and you can book. That was another egregious example. So really what we're talking about is these direct connections between these hotels and human rights abuses. And then, but what we really found at the end of 2024 and beginning of 2025, before this report was released, is this massive uptick in 2024 in particular, and then plans on building in 2025 of hotels. And really what the story changed from was these direct connections with human rights abuses. Now, those do exist in the report, but it really shifted the focus to just operational presence for these companies. We found a total of 189 hotels that are either open or planned to open in the Uyghur region. So if you look at, there's a chart on our website, you can see this graph that basically has this massive increase in 2024, 2025, and 2026 of these hotels being built and open. So it really changed from like just focusing on human rights abuses specific to some of the small group of hotels that existed to these hotel companies are on a building spree, a massive building spree across the Uyghur region. And if you trace back from 2024, 2025, contracts for these hotels would have been signed really at the height of repression in the region. And not only at the height, at the time when governments, so the US government, the French government, and the British government were talking about atrocity crimes. The US government said what's happening in the Uyghur region is genocide. The British and French parliaments both said that what's happening in the Uyghur region is genocide. And at the very same time, their own companies were signing contracts to build these massive, in some cases, luxury hotels in the Uyghur region. So that was sort of what the story changed into for us, is that, wow, there's so many companies pushing into the region at a time when they knew that atrocity crimes were taking place, or at least there were allegations. And that's kind of what we framed the report at in the end as this massive influx of these hotels, and how this really doesn't fit with their own publicly stated commitments to human rights or supporting human rights.
In Peter and Henrik's report, it says, 3 international hotel chains, Hilton, IHG, and Wyndham, are located in areas administered by the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, or XPCC, an entity under targeted sanctions by the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, and the European Union for its grave and systematic human rights violations. Now, my question is, why are these 3 hotel chains still able to operate without being penalized?
Right. So what we also found, as you say, are these hotels that are right on territory of a sanctioned entity, the XPCC, the Xinjiang Production Construction Corps. It is this sort of quasi-paramilitary entity that operates businesses, and it operates and controls land across the region, and these dots across the region. And again, you can look on these companies' websites, and you can find these hotels with satellite imagery. They're built straight on the territory of this sanctioned entity, right? You have American hotels on an entity that is sanctioned by the U.S. government, and this is something that we're looking into, and we're at least we've notified Treasury of this. And hopefully there will be some steps taken against these companies that have built these hotels. But again, that's just another clear example that, who in the compliance department of these hotels are looking at this? Is anybody looking at this? I think we found a total of 12 hotels straight on XPCC territory. Now, the U.S. government has sanctioned the XPCC itself as an entity. The British and French governments, or I should say the British government, has sanctioned the XPCC's Public Security Bureau. And then the European Union has also sanctioned the XPCC's Public Security Bureau, so not the entity in and of itself. But what does that say if your own companies are allowed to freely operate on territory that your own government has sanctioned for systemic human rights violations? Again, it's just another example of these hotels, and they just don't really care. There's presence across the region, amidst atrocity crimes, but also direct presence on this territory. It's almost as if they're asking to be caught by doing this, or these governments are not really holding them accountable, and we're trying to hold them accountable.
Peter and his organization, the Uyghur Human Rights Project, are not alone in calling these big corporations out. The Council on American Islamic Relations has also urged Hilton Worldwide Holdings to drop plans to build a hotel in Xinjiang region on the site where Chinese officials bulldoze and desecrate a mosque.
Right. So even more than just like basic hotels. So there used to be, there still are a number of Super 8s. So Wyndham, Super 8 is a sub-brand of Wyndham. That was the hotel chain that's been sort of present across the region for a number of years. But I think what we've seen more recently, especially in the last year or two, are these, and really sort of fitting in with the Chinese government's idea of tourism, a boom in tourism, and having travelers go to the region. You've seen this big influx and this big building spree also of luxury hotels. So in particular, Marriott, one of Marriott's sub-brands, and its sort of top luxury sub-brands, is the Ritz-Carlton. They're planning on building a Ritz-Carlton, and they're building it right now, and you can see it with satellite imagery in Urumqi, the capital of the region. They're building a Ritz-Carlton right there. And you can see the rendering if you look at our website, and if you look at the report. It's this grandiose glass tower that really stands out across the city. You don't see towers like this in the city, but Marriott's building a Ritz-Carlton. And what kind of signal does that send to people that these luxury hotels can exist in this region? For us, this is incredibly egregious that these companies, firstly, are allowed to build these hotels, or are able to build these hotels, but that they're building hotels that are catering to these kinds of tourists. How much money people are going to have to spend to get a room there. But also what's egregious is really this contrast we find with a luxury hotel property that international guests or Chinese guests can stay at versus, and if you look at maps of internment camps or prisons, a couple miles down the road, there's a prison where people have been sentenced for 20 years for nothing, right? For having a copy of the Quran maybe, or praying when they shouldn't be praying, things like this. So that contrast for us is particularly egregious. IHG, Intercontinental's hotel group, one of their top tier luxury properties is the Intercontinental. So if you go to these major cities, Intercontinental will sort of offer these very high-end resorts or hotels. They are planning to build 3 Intercontinentals across the region, opening in 2025 and 2026. So they have Intercontinental is planning on building 3, or IHG is planning on building 3 Intercontinental luxury hotels across the Uyghur region. One in Urumqi, another in Gulja, and then another in Kashgar, right? So again, this massive expansion of these hotels not only is very bad look, and also this contrast between that and the rights violations and atrocity crimes happening around in these regions versus what these companies are doing, and not only building hotels, but building hotels that are luxury in nature and catering towards this market. For us, it's just kind of gross to see this.
Peter is right. It is gross to see big corporations ignoring crimes against humanity and the ongoing genocide targeting the Uyghur communities. But they are not the only culprits. In recent years, we in Taiwan have seen a very sudden increase in influencers traveling to Xinjiang and promoting its tourism industry.
Tourism has been China's secret weapon in terms of normalizing the situation in the Uyghur region. I have set news alerts for, Urumqi and Xinjiang and Uyghur and things like this, and I see every single day a couple, 2 or 3 stories of people, tourists, going to the region. Often the promotion in state media of Western tourists, of foreign tourists who are coming to the region and, vlogging or whatever else, ostensibly showing that things are normal, that look how great things are. People don't mention what was happening previously. They just say, look, I'm in the bazaar, the Grand Bazaar in Urumqi, or in the bazaars in Kashgar, and look how clean this is, and look, I'm staying at this person's place. I'm outside the city, or I'm traveling to these UNESCO heritage sites, which we also wrote a report on, the destruction of heritage. But that's been a major phenomenon in the past few years of, from the Chinese government's perspective, let's move away from defending ourselves against criticism for human rights abuses to there's nothing to see here. There's so many people who are able to come to the region. So what could possibly be wrong? And they've really enlisted a lot of people in this. There's Chinese influencers, certainly, but also Western influencers, people from all sorts of countries going in and basically showing that, again, ostensibly things are fine, which is what we're trying to really combat through a series of reports on tourism, but also other reporting, showing that no, well, it might look on the surface like things are fine, but it's also good to keep in mind that, and we cite this in our report from April, the U.S. Holocaust Museum, their research center, the author in a report from January said that all of the conditions in the Uyghur region that led to atrocity crimes determinations, all of those conditions are still present, and some of them are expanding. Again, that's what we're trying to do, is demonstrate that there's still these abuses while tourism is happening. Now, why does China do this? It's about normalization. They just want to show that things are fine, and I think there's also an incentive structure that exists where people outside of China want to demonstrate that, they have some kind of credibility by going in and taking a few steps around and saying everything looks fine and not being very critical. And that's existed for a long time, but I think it's accelerated certainly recently.
If you go on YouTube and search Xinjiang, almost everything you see is YouTubers traveling to the region, repeating the Chinese rhetoric that everything in Xinjiang is normal and there's nothing to see here. But here's a message from the Vice President of the World Uyghur Congress, Ms. Rumate Arkan.
Don't do it. Perhaps they're getting paid, but it's really not worth it because you're contributing to China's ongoing abuses, atrocity crimes against Uyghurs. There's no way that most people will believe this propaganda, and it's just not worth it. And I think these influencers need to really reassess their values, their principles, and
Thank you for listening. This episode of The Divide is brought to you by Radio Taiwan International.